I'd like to warmly welcome Professor Mark Elliot from the University of Manchester, who will speak on data anonymisation. Before introducing Professor Elliot, I'd like to acknowledge that this session is kindly sponsored by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The ABS is Australia's national statistical agency, providing official statistics on a wide range of economic, social, population and environmental matters. The ABS also provide microdata, including linked data, to enable analysis for statistical and research purposes under safe conditions. We've already had several presentations based on research that uses the valuable linked data available from the ABS. IPDLN 2020 greatly appreciates the sponsorship from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I'd now like to introduce Professor Elliot. He's worked at the University of Manchester for almost 25 years, mainly in the field of confidentiality and privacy. He's one of the key international researchers in the field of statistical disclosure and collaborates widely with non-academic partners. In particular, he works with national statistical agencies and has been a key influence on disclosure control methodology used in censuses and surveys. The suite of software that he developed in collaboration with colleagues in computer science at the University of Manchester is used for measuring and assessing disclosure risk. Aside from confidentiality, privacy and disclosure, Professor Elliot's research interests include data science methodology and its application to the social sciences.
Hello, my name is Mark Elliot from the University of Manchester in the UK. I'm here to talk to you today about anonymisation and the ADF, also known as the Anonymization Decision-Making Framework. I'm going to give you an introduction into the UK Anonymization Network, talk about what is anonymisation, and then give you an overview of the ADF, the Anonymization Decision-Making Framework, which is about to be released of its second edition. And I'll be introducing the concept of data flows and how they are quite important in deciding whether data are anonymised or not. So first to the UK Anonymisation Network. So UCAN is an organisation that was set up in the UK in 2012. There are 4 partner organisations, 2 universities, the Office for National Statistics in the UK and the Open Data Institute. It was funded originally by the Information Commissioner's Office, our regulator, data protection regulator, and it was funded with the purpose of providing technical support for those who want to share data but need to anonymise that in order to do so. Okay, I'm going to first then talk about what is this thing, anonymisation. Okay, so there's a bit of terminology, anonymisation and other concepts, different perspectives on anonymisation. I'm going to introduce the notion of functional anonymisation and specifically focusing on this concept of data environments. So what is privacy? Privacy is about people. People, in essence, it is not primarily about data. Privacy is about people's control over their own lives, their space, their existence, their property, their relationships. It's often confused with this other concept, confidentiality. Confidentiality is completely and straightforwardly about data. So when I say to somebody, I'm telling you this in confidence, I'm asking you to participate in a boundary condition around you and I, past which data will not pass. So confidentiality is about data. You can apply the same principles to a duty of confidence between doctor and patient, or to a security system. They are all about boundaries, setting boundaries around information and data. So these two terms often get confused. They particularly get confused in the anonymisation literature and its companion concept, statistical disclosure control. And one could say something similar about the misnamed differential privacy. Okay, so if you're talking about confidentiality as a boundary condition, then you can think about that boundary being breached, and therefore you can think about the risk of such a thing happening. So it's meaningful to talk about confidentiality risk. And in a mature industry, risk consists of two components. The likelihood, first of all. One of the errors that people often make when thinking about confidentiality risk and the likelihood of a confidentiality breach is they confuse could with will. I'll illustrate by analogy. Could I, when I go for my walk after I finish my talk, be hit by a meteor? Well, yes, that is a possibility. Will I be hit by a meteor? Well, probably not. In fact, even thinking about it isn't really that functional. It's so unlikely that actually that's a non-functional thing to be doing. Could I be hit by a car? Yes. Will I be hit by a car? Well, if I'm not careful. So those two things illustrate the point that thinking about risk is something which we can do intuitively, and yet in the confidentiality and privacy arena, these two things often get confused. The other thing that happens in a mature industry is that we think about impact, and quite often in this area this gets ignored. We treat impacts as if they are apocalyptic. So this equation from Marsh et al. Explains some of why there's a problem here. This is a very old equation now, 40 years ago. Probability of identification equals the probability of attempt multiplied by the probability of identification given an attempt. Now the problem with the equation is that the second element, the probability of attempt, is incredibly difficult to measure, or even to how to think about measuring. And therefore most of the work is focused on this third part of the equation, the probability of identification given an attempt. And therefore some very sophisticated models have been developed looking at the structure of data and so forth. But however, we have tended to treat probability of attempt as if it is unity, 1, and that has led to overestimations of risk. So, as mentioned earlier on, we tend to treat impacts, the outcomes of confidentiality breach as apocalyptic. It's almost as if a nuclear power station is going up. Clearly, a privacy breach is rarely, if at all, anything like in the category of such a catastrophic event. And this has led to some very muddled thinking. So we're in the state where we treat the risk of an attempt as if it's unity, and we're tending to treat the impact of a privacy or confidentiality breach as if it's infinity. At Manchester we have a fourth framework where we think about precursors of events. How likely is the event to happen? What has to happen first in order for it to happen? And then what are the consequences of those events? So what is anonymization in this context? Anonymization is a process by which personal data are rendered non-personal. We make it very hard to re-identify someone. Now remember that it's a process, not a state, and therefore you have to be very careful when using success terms like anonymized. Unfortunately, these tend to lead people into thinking about finished jobs. I've anonymized the data, I need to do no more now. And you really need to be careful not to add adjectives on, and this is what people tend to do. When they start talking about anonymised, you'll hear this term, truly anonymised or fully anonymised, but isn't that just anonymised? And you know you've gone down a rabbit hole when you hear something like this, which I really did a couple of years ago. We do use the word anonymised, but we use it in the sense of reinforced, as in reinforced concrete. You don't expect reinforced concrete to be invincible, to be able to stand up against a nuclear bomb or a meteor. But you do expect it to stand up to the wear and tear that it's been designed to support. So here's some perspectives on anonymisation. So formal anonymisation is the removal or masking identifiers, or some pseudonymization comes into this category. It's rarely sufficient. Absolute anonymisation is the zero possibility of re-identification under any circumstances. And as indicated earlier on, this is a straw person. It doesn't actually mean anything. In fact, if you want actually data that's useful, absolute anonymisation is an impossibility. And obviously, if you don't have useful data, why have you got the data at all? Statistical anonymisation, and particularly statistical disclosure controls, attempt to overcome this by taking measurements of risk based on the structure of data. However, it's only part of the answer, because it doesn't consider the context in which the data are sitting. So this is a newish insight, most recently written up in 2018 in a paper on functional anonymisation. Essentially, that risk lies in the relationship between data and their environment. So what's this data environment I've been mentioning? This is a set of formal processes, informal processes, structures, mechanisms, agents, and either act on data, provide interpretable context for data, or define, control and interact with those data. Data environments always consist of these four things: other data, agents, usually people, security infrastructure, governance processes. Underpinning the notion of fundamental anonymisation are these 5 principles. Comprehensiveness principle states you cannot decide whether data are safe to share or not by examining the data alone, but you do need to examine the data. The utility principle states anonymisation is a process to produce safe data, but it only makes sense if what you're producing is safe, useful data. And these follow really from what I've said before. Realistic risk principle again follows. Zero risk data. Zero risk is infeasible if you want to produce useful data. And then the measures that you put in place to manage disclosure risk should be proportional to the likelihood and impact of that risk. So that's the proportionality principle. Drilling down to the comprehensiveness principle is that anonymisation is not about the data. That's a strange concept, but it's real. Anonymisation is about data situations. Data on their own are just inanimate digital stuff. Without context, they mean nothing. So anonymisation is about data in situations which are data interacting with their environment, the data environment. I've described anonymisation as a process, not a state, and I've introduced the notion of functional anonymisation, which is that the risk lies in the relationship between data and their environment, the data situation. Now I'm going to take you on to the Anonymization Decision-Making Framework, which is a process for delivering functional anonymization. The key question is, if you're handling data, how do you deliver your responsibilities? Firstly, you need to understand exactly how and precisely how a confidentiality breach might occur, understand the possible consequences of that breach, and then reduce the risk of the breach occurring to a negligible level. What is the ADF? Well, it's a system for delivering your responsibilities. You can use it as a tool for developing an anonymization policy, a practical tool for understanding your data situation and managing confidentiality risk, both the likelihood and the impact within your situation. It's not a checklist, and it is a book, which I shall refer you to later. How was it created? Well, it was a 4-year process between 2012 and 16, a series of multi-stakeholder workshops from all sectors of the UK economy and outside, and it answers the question, what is anonymisation? The collation of thinking was drawn into a book, and drafts of the book were reviewed by an international cross-sectoral panel of reviewers. Hundreds of comments were received, and the book was eventually published in 2016. An Australian edition was published in autumn of 2017. In the second edition, the review of the book took place in 2018 and 19. There were input from 3 advisory groups: the user community, the legal group and the scientific expert committee. Changes for GDPR and national legislation and further conceptual development happened. New materials, there's going to be a compact version released very shortly, practitioner facing, short summary documents and posters and leaflets, and we're looking at producing an app. What has changed? Well, we've got new components, new content, concepts, particularly in the notion of focus, steps and streams. Data flows and provenance are now central to our understanding. The legal material is now a parallel structure rather than a single component. There are companion documents and there's tools and templates built in. So this is a new ADF, 10-step process. Describe, capture the presenting problem. Sketch your data flow and determine your responsibilities. Map your properties of data environment. Describe and map the data. Engage the stakeholders and evaluate the data situation. So those first 6 steps are what we call the data situation audit. And this is a standalone activity. For many situations and organisations, it's invaluable in and of itself. The evaluation then leads to decisions about whether you need to employ disclosure controls or disclosure risks, further disclosure risk analysis. And that's the second activity. And then finally, impact management. There's a lot built into the Anonymization Framework about maintaining relationships with stakeholders as being vital to managing risk. Remember that risk is also about impact. Impact is partly about people's understandings and perceptions. Plan what you do if things go wrong. So have in place a contingency plan which will reduce the impact, therefore reduce the risk, and then monitor the evolving data situation, i.e. don't release and forget. Just going to move on to that last component now. That first component now, because it's actually quite central. Sketch the data flow. So what is a data situation? I'm going to give you some example data flows and think about data provenance, and we're looking quite deeply into that. We have a project alongside the new developments funded by the Alan Turing Institute on provenance and anonymization. So what is the presenting problem? Is it static or dynamic? i.e. are data in one place or are they moving? Is it single or multi-step? Is it single or multi-stream? So steps are steps in a transition. Streams are different divergent paths for data. What are the data environments? How does it relate to the data in question? How do those environments relate to the data in question? And which environments, steps, streams are you responsible for? You that are using the framework. It's very simple. Data flow. One organisation collects data, shares it with a second organisation. That might be called the standard unit of a share. Slightly more complex data flow, where one organisation shares with another, and then that second organisation then publishes output from that data. Again, a fairly standard basic unit of data flow. However, these get quite complicated quite quickly. This is an example. We were working with the pharmaceutical company Roche and looking at their publication via the European Medicines Agency and other routes of outputs from clinical studies, particularly clinical study reports, which they need to pass over to the EMA under European law. There are obviously complexities in this data situation. There are big complexities in the data. We think about environments, we encapsulate them in these particular way, and we have framings for these, and we have ways of scoring different types of environments and their interactions with data. So this is a secure laboratory where data are kept fairly locked down, and this is the open data environment, which itself is an environment. So my concluding remarks. Anonymization Decision-Making Framework is a tool which allows you to think constructively about your data situation, and it moves us closer to a harmonised idea of anonymization. It's in use all over the world. We've had over 20,000 downloads of our book. The second edition to be released, we hope, this week. The open access book is available from our website. You can get the first edition now. So it's www.ukanon.net. And thank you for listening.
I'd like to thank Professor Elliot for a terrific presentation, and also thank the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who's the sponsor for this session.